Welcome back. It is time now for The World This Week here on France at 24. And we might be just 7 days into the year 2022, but already we've got plenty to be talking about. Coming up in this edition, we'll be examining the unrest that's been sweeping Kazakhstan. There you can see some of the protests that kicked off this week and turned deadly. We'll also talk you through Thursday's commemorations of the first anniversary of the 6th of January assault on the US Capitol, and with a dramatic spike in COVID infections here in France. We ask, what does all of this mean for President Macron with just 3 months to go before presidential elections? Plus, we'll have the latest on Novak Djokovic's bid to play in the Australian Open. So lots to be discussing. For all of that, I'm joined by Time Magazine's Paris correspondent, Vivienne Walt. A very warm welcome to you, Vivienne. We are joined as well by the Wall Street Journal reporter Matthew Dalton, who's also in Paris. Welcome to you. Plus, we're joined by Stéphane de Vries, the correspondent for the French financial daily Les Echos, and Euronews, who joins us from Amsterdam. So, we're going to start in Kazakhstan, where the country's president has given the green light to security forces to shoot to kill those taking part in the unrest that's been sweeping the Central Asian nation this week. Well, dozens of people have been killed in the violence, which erupted after a sharp increase in fuel prices, reflecting wider discontent with the authoritarian rule there. Well, in response to a call from President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, the Russian-led peacekeepers have already arrived there in Kazakhstan. The president says the protesters are terrorists, and he's dismissed all talk of negotiations as being nonsense. Here's the Kazakh president.
Terrorists continue to damage public and private property and use weapons against citizens. I gave an order to law enforcement agencies and the army to open fire without warning. There have been calls abroad for the parties to move the negotiations to a peaceful resolution of the problems. What nonsense! What kind of negotiations can there be with criminals, with murderers? They have to be destroyed, and that will be done soon.
Okay, the president of Kazakhstan speaking there. So clearly protests kicked off quickly and descended into violence. Let me start by asking you, Vivienne, I mean, how is it that that movement gathered so much steam so quickly? And do you think it's now been ended?
Well, you know, we see it as being quick, but there have been years of seething frustrations in Kazakhstan, which is, on the face of it, a hugely wealthy country. It's extremely rich in fossil fuels, minerals of all kinds, particularly uranium, and yet the great majority of the country is living really on very, very little money. So all the elements were there for an explosion. All they needed was something like a hike in the gas prices, which was certainly enough to set people off, and obviously has become far greater and more serious given the loss of life.
Matthew, let me put it to you. I mean, there were accusations from Russia and from Kazakhstan that this is all due to foreign interference. There are foreign actors engaged there in Kazakhstan, and therefore it's got nothing to do with the genuine grievances that Vivienne was just talking about. It's all to do with a foreign plan. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think we've seen any evidence for that. This certainly seems like an organic response to an increase in fuel prices, and combined with other unrest that Vivienne was talking about. You know, when you raise fuel prices, we saw it in France with the Gilets jaunes movement. You know, you see it in other places where fuel prices rise. Public discontent goes with it, and it's not a kind of implausible explanation for why there's been so much anger in Kazakhstan. And I think, you know, this is something that authoritarian leaders like Mr. Putin, like the leader of Kazakhstan, often like to do when they're confronted with domestic unrest, is to try and blame foreign elements for kicking things up, stirring things up, and there's really been no evidence of that.
Okay, so you're saying it's a hollow accusation. It's the sort of thing we've heard in other countries too, where wherever there's an ally of Russia that finds themselves in difficulty, it's always foreign actors, isn't it? President Tokayev has been in power for 2 years. Let me just ask you, Stefan, I mean, how viable is his term looking? I mean, is he going to be able to last the course, do you think? Okay, seems like there's a sound issue there, Stefan. We'll come back to you. Let me put that to you, Vivian. Do you think President Tokayev is sounding like he's starting to wobble, or would you say that he's showing no signs of that whatsoever?
I think it depends on a couple of things, and don't forget we're like 18 months into a somewhat similar crisis in Belarus, where nobody thought that President Lukashenko was going to survive more than a couple of months, and 18 months later, he shows no signs of leaving. So I think it partly depends on how quickly and how forcefully Russia intervenes, which it could do, given how strategically important a huge country like Kazakhstan is. It's not Belarus. It's an enormous, rich country in the middle of Europe. And I think it also depends on internal factions. As your correspondent in Tbilisi was saying during the news broadcast, that there are sort of signs of internal splits and perhaps rivalries and factions between the former president and his allies and the current president. So if those play out in a way that weakens the current presidency, you might well see the possibility of this regime falling apart.
Let's try Stefan again in Amsterdam. Stefan, your thoughts? I mean, a shoot-to-kill order from the president. Is he looking stronger or weaker as a result of these developments this week?
Well, I think I agree with Vivian, who actually talks about Belarus. Of course, it's quite similar, although this country is much larger. It's about the size of the European Union. So vast is Kazakhstan. So shooting at demonstrators, I think that's typically from the handbook of dictators, of course, and then sending in the peacekeeping force from Russia. It sounds like a contradiction in terms, actually. And once again, we as Europeans are actually bystanders of what is happening not very far away from our own borders. I think for now, the Tokayev can count on the support of Russia. But of course, it all depends how long Russia thinks it still has interests in Kazakhstan, and considering the vast amounts of oil and gas in that area, I think the Kremlin is absolutely willing to continue to support this leader. Also because they're probably afraid, or they could be afraid, that similar actions, similar movements will start in Russia, where also the prices are increasing. So for the time being, I think unfortunately Tokayev is having all the cards in his hands.
Sure, and before I start talking about contagion, which I want to pick up on in just a moment, and the idea that we could have some overflow and some spillover of this unrest, let's actually listen to the president of Belarus, who we've been speaking about here, drawing parallels between developments in Belarus a year or so ago and developments in Kazakhstan right now. Here's President Alexander Lukashenko.
Kazakhstan is an attempt to attack the post-Soviet states along the perimeter of Russia. Therefore, whatever the cost, we need to preserve the center of our civilization, the center of our orthodoxy, and not only that, but also the lands that are now part of the Russian Federation.
Okay, so that was the president of Belarus giving his thoughts on those developments in Kazakhstan. Matthew Dalton, I mean, let me ask you, what is the interest in Moscow's decision? Why would they want to prop up another, what appears to be, deeply unpopular government?
Well, it's a country that, they share a huge border with Russia. Big energy producer. They're one of the world's biggest producers of uranium, if not the largest producer of uranium for nuclear power plants, located in a very strategic location on the. They share a big border with Afghanistan, which is obviously in turmoil right now, and so that it sort of sits in the middle of all these cross currents, and just its sheer size. Moscow does not want to see this country in turmoil. They want a government that's friendly to Moscow, that's not going to challenge their interests in the region, and that's not going to further destabilize things in the region when there's already been a big destabilizing force with what's happened in Afghanistan, all the tension that's happening in Ukraine. It's probably another ball in the air that the Kremlin does not want to juggle.
Yeah, and sure. And all the while, we're hearing out of Washington as I speak, reflection on what's happening on the Russian border with Ukraine. Do we see Putin's focus perhaps shifting, albeit on a temporary basis, from those developments there? Your thoughts, Vivian?
Well, I was just about to say, actually, what's happening in Kazakhstan is probably good news for those in Ukraine that fear a kind of Russian invasion or another Crimea-type crisis as there was in 2014. In some aspects, possibly also, shifts some of the scenarios that somebody like President Macron is dealing with as he takes over the presidency of the EU, of is he going to have a war in Ukraine to deal with during his 6-month rotation? And maybe this makes it slightly less likely. There are only so many fronts, presumably, that the Russians can think of intervening in at any one time.
Yeah, sure. Quite a lot of Moscow's allies are in a moment of need, and indeed the situation in Ukraine is a concern. There is a limited number of areas where Russia can be involved in. We've been talking today about Russian involvement in Mali as well. What are your thoughts, Stefan?
Yes, of course, there are many fronts now where Russia wants to be active. But at the same time, of course, Putin is also facing problems domestically. He will have to choose his battles almost literally, I'm afraid. And indeed, a crisis such as in Kazakhstan, I think the main interest now for Putin is that it doesn't spill over into Russia, that people will not get any ideas or wrong ideas in the eyes of the Kremlin. And of course, the people in Ukraine could be maybe a little bit relieved, but because if there are more conflicts around the borders of Russia, maybe that means that there is less pressure on the borders of Ukraine and Russia. It's a very complicated situation, and one is wondering on what chessboard Putin is actually playing right now.
Okay, and just before we move on to the next topic, Matthew, can I just ask for your final thoughts on Kazakhstan and where you sort of see developments heading to from here?
Well, it seems like the unrest is going to be put down by force, unfortunately, and with the support of all the governments, China as well, Russia. And really the absence of any desire by the West to really get involved in what's happening in Kazakhstan. This is a different situation than Belarus, where Lukashenko really provoked Europe by diverting a European flight into Belarusian airspace and to arrest a dissident. This is something that the European Union and even the United States couldn't turn a blind eye to, or really had to react forcefully to. With Kazakhstan, this is a fairly domestic problem that obviously the EU doesn't want to see. The Tokayev start shooting people, start shooting protesters on the street, but they're not going to do something really drastic to stop that from happening.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. Let's move on now to our next subject, because, of course, this week it was all eyes on Washington on Thursday. This as commemorations were held to mark the first anniversary of the 6th of January assault on the US Capitol. well, almost no Republicans joined the Democrats in what some had hoped would be a day of reconciliation. Instead, it was a fresh display of a nation that remains deeply divided. Well, in his 25-minute address in the ornate statutory hall, President Joe Biden, with his voice booming at times, urged all Americans to protect the country's fragile democracy. He also pinned the blame for those deadly events on the 6th of January squarely on his predecessor, Donald Trump. Here's a clip of what he said.
And here's the truth. The former President of the United States of America has created and spread a web of lies about the 2020 election. He's done so because he values power over principle, because he sees his own interest as more important than his country's interest, than America's interest, and because his bruised ego matters more to him than our democracy or our Constitution. He can't accept he lost. He's not just a former president. He's a defeated former president.
President Joe Biden speaking there on Thursday. So what we've heard from President Donald Trump doesn't sound in the least bit remorseful. And if anything, you know, perhaps these events show that former President Trump's grip on a large swathe of America persists. And I just want to ask you, Matthew, to start off by just telling us, I mean, not much success on Thursday, I wouldn't say. I don't know what your opinion is, in reconciling the nation at this particular juncture. What would you say?
I'd agree with you. No success whatsoever. Of course, Biden wasn't going to be able to do that in one speech, but the party, the Republican Party, has almost completely bought into Trump's false claims that the election was stolen. Very few prominent Republicans have stood up and to these claims. You know, we saw some prominent Republicans like Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, after January 6th happened, and you know, Mike Pence stand together with Democrats and say, no, we can't allow this this kind of behavior to happen, and President Trump is wrong. The election was not stolen. Those voices have grown very quiet in the years since then, and Mitch McConnell offered a pretty tepid and basically a tepid denouncement of Trump. And in fact, most of his criticism was turned toward Biden, saying that his speech was very divisive. It's interesting that Biden took a kind of different tactic than he has for the last year. He really confronted Trump and confronted this idea in this speech in a way, and his strategy before that was more to try and minimize Trump, to almost kind of try and ignore him. And I think he's realized that Trump cannot be ignored. He's one of the leading contenders to be the Republican candidate for president. He is the de facto leader of the party. He's the most popular figure in the party. So it seems like the White House and Biden decided that they had to take him on because there are few other voices in the Republican Party that are standing up to him.
Okay, so Vivian, given that President Trump has tried marginalizing Trump, President Biden has tried marginalizing President Trump, President Biden has tried taking on former President Trump, as he did yesterday. I mean, what's his best shot at basically trying to change the narrative, to try to convince those Republicans, those hardcore Trump supporters, that perhaps the narrative surrounding the stolen election and where fault and blame lies for those developments on the 6th of January of last year, how does he go about changing that, or is it just mission impossible?
Look, I mean, to begin with, I think obviously it was a wonderful speech. It was impassioned and articulate and heartfelt. But it was also a very kind of loud sign of how utterly impotent the Democrats are in the face of what's going on. And I think President Biden's problem is that this is not really about former President Trump, although it is, of course, but it's about a far bigger issue, which is the erosion of democracy. And that's a historic, maybe, turning point, which if it does turn, is going to be exceedingly difficult to come back from. And it seems from President Biden's point of view, the problem is that there isn't really a sense of real urgency among people. The Democrats have been extremely divided among themselves over economic issues and infrastructure and budget and all sorts of issues that have taken up energy and focus over the past year that President Biden's been in office, and has taken their eye off what is, in my mind at least, a far bigger, more urgent question, which is the erosion of voting rights, the replacement right across all 50 states of secretaries of state who certify elections, that President Trump and his allies have been setting in place very systematically with great discipline right across the US. And they're realizing it and mobilizing around it very, very late.
Yeah, and I can see Stefan there nodding as you've been speaking. Would you like to add to that, Stefan?
Yeah, I do agree with Vivian when she says that it was a passionate speech, but I found Joe Biden not very confident, and I think that indeed has to do with the fact that he probably realizes that democracy is not a certainty, not even in America, that democracy is still under threat, and that when he became president since then, so almost a year ago, he never really repaired all the damages that have been done by not only the storming of the Capitol, of course, but in general, the fact that many Americans do not trust the government anymore, do not trust any institutions anymore. I think there's a big rift in American society, similar to a rift we also see in Western European democracies, let's say the older democracies. There is a growing divide by a group of people who no longer trust their leaders, who no longer trust elections, they don't longer trust democracy. And I think Joe Biden is very well aware of this fact. And that's, I think, why, to me, he didn't appear very confident in his speech this week about, well, actually he referred often to Donald Trump, the president, but he never mentioned the name, as if he was Voldemort, the name you can't mention. But so I think it's a sign of the times. And unfortunately, Joe Biden, in my opinion, has not been able in a year to repair all the damage Donald Trump has done during his presidency.
And how would you rate his chances, Matthew, of perhaps continuing and perhaps getting some more results in that effort to reconcile the nation, perhaps during his next 3 years in office? He's done 1 year, 3 to go.
Well, I think it's going to be difficult as long as you have leaders in the Republican Party, and in particular Donald Trump, and who have broken very important norms around democracy. The most important being, when you lose an election that has been fairly held, you accept the results and congratulate the winner and move on. And Donald Trump has done something that American democracy hasn't seen, maybe for more than 100 years. He spread deliberate falsehoods about the results of that election, refused to accept the results. And when you have the leader of one of America's major political parties who is doing that, you're sending a signal to somewhat less than half the country that the system is broken. And so you almost can't, the protesters, the January 6th protesters should not have done what they did. But, when they heard what Donald Trump was saying, their leader, and he said, the election has been stolen and you need to fight for this. That was an incredibly inflammatory thing for him to have said. And it kind of cascaded a whole series of events that led to what happened. The prime cause of that, all of that happening, is Donald Trump breaking that very important norm that all democracy rests on, more or less.
Absolutely. And actually quite striking, just looking at a poll. I mean, there have been lots of polls in the last couple of days about where responsibility lies for the 6th of January events. But the poll I picked out shows that last year, the percentage of Americans who blame President Donald Trump was 50%. So that was in the immediate aftermath of the attacks. It's now 57%. So a year later, 57% of Americans polled say blame rests with Donald Trump. Added to that, okay, that's only one poll and it's a shift of 7%. It's not dramatic. But added to that, the other investigations into the Trump family's business dealings, the continued investigation into the attack on the Capitol, other legal woes hanging over Donald Trump. Couldn't Donald Trump end up being the worst enemy the Republican Party could possibly have if developments unfold as they could do in a way that is not at all favourable to him in these various legal wranglings? So what are your thoughts? Can I put that to you, Vivienne?
Well, I think anyway, Donald Trump is the worst enemy of the Republican Party. Let's not forget this is like a very well-established and until recently an extremely well-respected political party, whether or not you agree with their views. And Donald Trump has sought to kind of undermine and basically destroy that political history. So leaving that aside, yes, it's possible that Donald Trump could be convicted. He could even face prison terms. I'm not sure that that will do much in terms of diminishing his kind of cult status among many Republicans that has become somewhat divorced from reality and divorced from any kind of rational thinking. It might even enhance his standing as a kind of martyr. I think that what's happening on a kind of state level across the US is much more worrying. And let's not forget presidential elections are fought on state level. It's state by state that any presidential campaign has to be fought. And it's at that level that Trump and his allies have really tapped into and are really kind of, as I said before, systematically kind of dismantling voter rights wherever they can.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Vivienne. You've had the last word in that particular subject. Let's move on to our next topic. Here in France, officials say that the current COVID-19 wave could reach its peak in about 10 days from now. That's what they said this Friday. Well, on Monday, the situation was actually even more serious than we had thought, because updated figures show that there were actually more than 400,000 new cases here in France on that one day, Monday, setting a terrifying new record. The latest figures we've got for you as well, that this Friday, 328,000 new cases have been announced for the last 24 hours. And there you can see the progression throughout the week. We're talking about some pretty big numbers there. That has been the number of cases, as you can see on our screens. And as I said, the Monday figure has been upgraded to that high figure of more than 400,000. Well, President Emmanuel Macron has been in the headlines all of this week over comments he made in an interview in which he vowed to make life as difficult as possible for those who refused to get vaccinated. Well, he now says he stands by his controversial choice of words, which some saw as being rather vulgar.
We may be moved by expressions which seem common. I fully recognize it. I am moved by the situation we are in. The real fracture of the country is there. When some people make their freedom a slogan, it becomes a lack of responsibility. And not only do they endanger the lives of others, but they restrict the freedom of others too. And that I cannot accept.
President Emmanuel Macron speaking this Friday, defending his choice of words. Matthew, let me ask you, since you're in Paris, do you think it's fair to say that these last few days there's been more headlines made and more discussion about the president's choice of words in that now famous Parisien interview than perhaps there has been about this rather alarming uptick in the number of infections?
Maybe, yeah, probably, I guess I'd agree with you, although they're both intimately linked. There are still, France has a very high vaccination rate. More than 90% of people age of 12 and older are vaccinated. fully vaccinated. But that still leaves several million adults who have not been vaccinated. And given the huge number of cases we're seeing, if even a small percentage of those people wind up in the hospital, wind up in intensive care units, you're going to see hospitals and intensive care units potentially overwhelmed again. And we've seen, hospitalizations are rising. They're not rising nearly as fast as they did in previous waves because of the vaccinations. But the risk is there, and Macron sees that even this small group of unvaccinated people who have steadfastly refused to get vaccinated despite all the pressure that the government has put on with requiring vaccinations for going into restaurants and cafes and really having any life whatsoever. There's this very hard core of people who have resisted this, and so he's trying to put the spotlight on them, and we'll see if it works. I don't think it's going to harm him politically all that much, but we'll see if the bottom, sort of the more important thing, is whether it's effective in getting these last remaining vaccine holdouts to act, and that remains to be seen.
Stefan, did this generate an awful lot of traction? You're based in Amsterdam. I'm just wondering, in Holland, were people talking about President Macron and his? Of course, you've got COVID issues of your own in the Netherlands and a lockdown. So, I mean, what do people make of this?
No, of course, what was interesting was that there was a lot of debate online, but also with my Anglophone colleagues about the exact translation of what he has said. You just said making people's lives difficult or miserable. Actually, what he said was to annoy or to irritate, but actually was far more vulgar. In English, probably he meant something like to piss off the people. And I think it was it was not a slip of the tongue, because Emmanuel Macron is known for that he never really improvises anything. He really thinks about things when he opens his mouth. So this was probably a very carefully crafted expression that he used a couple of times over the 2 hours of interview that he gave to readers of Le Parisien, the daily newspaper in Paris. And it could also be, well, many of his critics said that this is unworthy for a president, but actually this was not a president talking, it was a candidate talking. He is now still not an official candidate, but I think by saying such a word, he knew that he would trigger the other candidates, and that he would actually have the advantage of using a word that many French can relate to, because as you mentioned rightly, over 90% of the adults are vaccinated. So many French feel that they have to pay for the unvaccinated, all the measures that are now in place. So it was not an accident. It was a very carefully chosen word. And we're talking about only that this week. So it was a way of Macron to start his presidential campaign, re-election campaign, even though he's still officially not a candidate. So it was an interesting development this week, and we've been talking about this word more actually than about the crisis that's going on in France, of course.
Certainly, and we didn't know about those 400,000 plus cases on Monday when this all erupted. Let me ask you, Vivian, is the president right to be using this kind of colloquial language when we're 3-4 months away from a presidential election? Your thoughts?
Absolutely, and I totally agree with Stefan. It was well planned and well crafted and kind of a coup, I think. I mean, all in one go. With one little phrase, he comes off as being a very relatable guy, not the, remote elite president. And he also, I think, expresses exactly what many, many people in France think. The sense is right now that everybody knows somebody who has COVID, if not quite a few people who have COVID, and they're just sick and tired of people who refuse to get vaccinated, because there is one way out of this pandemic, and that is to get everybody vaccinated. Of course, leaving aside the entire parts of the world where they can't get vaccines. But here we are in a rich, prosperous, privileged position of having too many vaccines and having people who have the luxury of saying no to them. And actually, in my other capacity as a correspondent for Fortune magazine, we this week, yesterday, deployed Ipsos, the polling agency, to ask people in France and Italy what they thought of these new vaccine mandates. And even a good proportion of unvaccinated people in France thought that Macron's idea about a vaccine mandate was actually quite good. And many of them were planning to get a jab within the next month. So I think that he did, I think he will come out probably at an advantage having done this.
Okay, well, we haven't left too much time for our next story, so we're going to have to move on. Novak Djokovic, the world tennis #1, has been refused entry to Australia due to his vaccine status. While Djokovic opposes mandatory vaccines, the initial decision to grant him entry to the country outraged many people in Australia, which is battling a surge of infections. Well, the 34-year-old Serbian has been held at a detention facility in Melbourne pending his appeal. The authorities in Canberra have rejected suggestions he's a prisoner, but here's what his father said about it all.
They want to keep him not only in custody, but in jail until Monday. Think about it. Until Monday, they will keep him. The best sportsman in the world, in jail.
Okay, well, that's Team Djokovic speaking in Belgrade. Spain's Rafael Nadal, however, says he feels sorry for his arrival.
If he wanted, he will be playing here in Australia without a problem. No, he's free to take their own decisions, but then there are some consequences. No, and of course, I don't like the situation that is happening. In some way, I feel sorry for him. But at the same time, he knew the conditions since a lot of months ago.
Okay, Rafael Nadal speaking there, saying his actions have consequences. Matthew, let me ask you. I mean, it really doesn't look like Djokovic will be playing in the Australian Open, does it? It's in 10 days from now.
No, it doesn't. It seems like Australia is pretty determined not to allow him in, and with good reason, because Australia, A, is battling a surge in COVID cases, and B, Australia's rules on COVID have been some of the tightest in the entire world. There have been really tough lockdowns, restrictions on travel that have lasted for months and months and months. So, this is a country of people that have had a difficult pandemic, and you can sort of question whether that approach was the right one, whether it was too strict. But the approach was there, and there's probably a lot of appetite in the government and in the country more generally to make sure that nobody gets special treatment, even a famous athlete, and maybe particularly a famous athlete, because what kind of signal does that send that
Absolutely.
The rules are for little people?
Absolutely. We've got about a minute left. Stefan, let me ask you, is this going to damage the legacy of Djokovic?
Yeah, I think it will. I mean, his father said that he's the best sportsman in the world, but he also showed by this action that he's probably one of the most arrogant sportsmen in the world. Rules apply to everybody if you're a champion or not, and especially in Australia. And like Nadal said, he knew what the rules were already a couple of months ago. So it's just plain arrogance, and it's a pity because, of course, he's a wonderful sportsman, but he's not a very good diplomat.
Okay, Vivian, let me just ask you lastly. I mean, picking up on what both gentlemen have said, the rules apply to everyone. He's no different. Stefan going a little bit further, saying he's an arrogant man. He's being held in a facility with grey walls, locked windows, and it's home to scores of asylum seekers. Not exactly the sort of treatment he's used to. Might this give him a slice of necessary humble pie, as perhaps the two gentlemen sitting next to you might say?
Well, absolutely. I mean, he'll get a taste of how the other 99.9% of people live. I had a laugh when his father was on TV saying Novak is Serbia and Serbia is Novak. I mean, Novak is Monaco, which is where he lives. He's an exceptionally wealthy man. And I totally agree with what both Matthew and Stefan said. There is no way that the government could have allowed him to get away with this. And I think that particularly given who he is, they need to make it clear that they will just treat him like any other person.
Okay, well, if he's watching, I interviewed Novak Djokovic about 10 years ago. I thought he was rather nice and a humble and clever man, but perhaps a lot has changed in the last 10 years. Thank you so much. You've had the last word. Vivian Walt, thank you so much for speaking to us. Thank you as well to Matthew Dalton and also to Stefan de Vries in Amsterdam. Thank you so much to the three of you. Thanks to you for watching. That was The World This Week.